Thank you, and thank you Paul, Glenn, and the whole ICLR team for hosting this. Today, we have an amazing panel of 4 speakers from LexisNexis Risk Solutions and JBA Risk Management to take you through a deep dive of the flood maps prepared for IBC and customized to IBC's specification. The panel includes Simon Delahoyte, Richard Toomey, Dermot McNally from LexisNexis, and Helix Smith from JBA. And together, they are the dream team that made this project possible. I'm here to tell you a little bit about the work that Insurance Bureau of Canada, IBC, is doing in the flood space and why we have commissioned the development of this flood map. Well, IBC turned its attention to the flood issue in 2013, following the Alberta and Toronto floods that occurred earlier that summer. Then, the direction from our board was as follows. First, facilitate and promote the development of a private residential flood insurance market. And second, work with government to find a solution for these very high-risk properties that are unlikely to ever find affordable access to flood cover in the private market, so that the financial and reputational challenges that emerged in 2013 won't repeat themselves in the future, and as to avoid any future potential regulatory pressures that might otherwise emerge. And as you can see from both these objectives, there stems to naturally the need for our industry to have good, solid risk maps. Maps that insurers can access to start writing coverage, and maps that IBC and government can leverage to identify where and who these high-risk Canadians are and how to deal with them. So after 6 months of research on available geospatial data all across the country, we worked with our members to find the best vendors for the project and commission the development of the model to JBA and LexisNexis. Now that the maps have been released, we are in full sharing mode with government, and IBC members have the opportunity to license the maps from JBA and LexisNexis at a preferred discount rate. Now I'm going to let Simon walk you through some of the details. Simon is the head of sales for LexisNexis Risk Solutions, and he leads the team that helped us turn the JBA maps into a powerful analytics tool. I won't be able to stay for the whole duration of the webinar, but if you have any questions or you want to find out more about what IBC is doing on the flood file, give us a call or drop us a line at ibc.ca. Now, before I actually pass this on to Simon, a little logistics around questions time. As you can see from the screen, please type your questions in the question box. You can type questions at any time, and you do not need to wait until the end. We will be having a question period at the end of the webinar, and please make questions short and specific. Now, Simon, take it away.
Many thanks, Lapo. Yes, my name is Simon Delahoyte. I run the sales operation for LexisNexis Risk Solutions, based out of London, England, but with a lot of time spent in your Canadian market. I'm going to speak for not longer than 10 minutes, really introducing the work that we have done in collaboration with IBC before Richard, Dermot and Helen take on the next levels of detail in explaining more about the project and the deliverables. LexisNexis came into the Canadian market back in 2011, but for 6 years prior to that, we have been working solely within the property insurance market in building risk assessment tools for exposure management and accumulation management that in excess of 35 insurance companies in the UK and Ireland and now Canada are using. These tools are embedded right into the heart of the workflow processes that our clients are reliant upon at point of quotation for consistent underwriting with respect to managing perils and managing the level of accumulation within those perils. We feel we have extensive experience of many of the aspects that are specific to the technical underwriting process of managing flood. Back in 2011, we chose to come into the Canadian market because we saw significant similarities between the way that the Canadian market and the UK and Irish markets work. To some degree, a similar potential, if not realized, exposure to climate change and natural catastrophe events. We had no crystal ball, of course, with respect to what was going to happen in the summer of 2013, but it felt the similarities between the markets were extremely high. That really drove the discussions that began with the team at IBC, whose very clear vision was to provide the Canadian market with clear guidance and support leading towards some form of program in Canada that managed pluvial and fluvial risk. And to that end, the data, which is a large part of what we're going to talk about today, was identified as being necessary to improve the quality of. So I want to talk a little bit more about that in terms of the key goals of the program that we put in place with IBC. We really wanted to build that high quality pluvial and fluvial data set that brought together input and content from many sources, those sources including, of course, digital terrain models, river networks, highly accurate geocoding capabilities, information about the property stock across Canada, and market share as well. All of these elements are leading to really two end goals. One was to support IBC in its desire and need to quantify the level of flood risk that is occurring across Canada and therefore be able to make some considered judgment on the level of loss. And allied to that are several pieces of analysis and process that are required in order to get to that decision point, get to that understanding. We're going to walk you through many of those levels of analysis, the data gathering, the type of outputs we're putting together. But our real goals were to quantify the exposure, be able to give a vision of the loss potential, and to drive the type of decision making that's needed as a precursor to the creation of a national flood program. From an insurer's point of view, the flow down benefits of the data set, the hazard model, the pluvial and the fluvial hazard model, is to embed that at point of quotation as part of the underwriting process that gives every channel that is seeking to quantify the level of risk at a property location the ability to understand the flood factors that are applied to that location. So we're going to talk about, in addition to the data today, we're going to talk about how that delivery process works and how insurers can build into their workflow the capability to harness the data in the most effective way, consistent underwriting guidelines and rules that are built into your business processes. Just 2 or 3 slides that I'm sure you are very familiar with in terms of setting the scene of the Canadian market. The first slide here is just showing how the trending over quite some number of years is on the up in terms of the trend of the losses that are occurring in Canada as a consequence of Nat Cat events. The graphic towards the right-hand half of the screen shows the return on investment, that there's been a sliding scale of the level of return based on, well, here are 2 examples, one a governmental bond and the other the return on investment of the property and casualty initiatives that have been put into the Canadian insurance market over the last 20 years. What I would say is that in our experience, the positive impact, the positive return on investment that is found from the implementation of a high-quality flood model, together with embedding that at point of underwriting, is high. The improvement in loss ratios is significant. Our experience in the United Kingdom shows that that loss ratio improvement is within the range of 2 to 4%, 2 to 3.5%, when implemented right, when implemented across the varying processes within the business, and that includes reinsurance treaty renegotiation included. So there's significant benefit that we can point to in this return on investment model. Moving on slides to specifically look at the level of losses that have been incurred over the past 9 to 10 years. Actually, the numbers that are off this graph are 2013's record year losses at over 3 billion Canadian dollars. But again, as a way of indicating trend, the factors, the importance with which we are all looking at ensuring that the market is best positioned with the right data is very clearly directed. We're directed by this type of information. And my final slide here really simply talks about the events that have occurred in recent history and the size of those, all the way up to what happened in summer 2013 in Calgary with that event. That what is now the case is that water-related losses are the #1 peril in the Canadian market, outstripping that of fire and windstorm events. And it's not by way of wishing to be at all scaremongering, but we all know, we all sense that there will be more events. They could be around the corner, they could be 5 years away. Our experience in the UK was that between 2003 and 2011 we had 5 significant events ranging from 200 million insured loss all the way to 3.5 billion at our largest event in 2007. And then since 2011 all went a little bit quiet, and we've been faced with 2 significant events over the last 2 years, of which the one that has recently occurred in December in the UK was particularly significant in its size. That is my introduction, setting the scene to some degree. I'm going to hand across to my colleague Richard Toomey. Richard heads up our GIS analytics group, and he's going to talk about how we have taken the results and quantified the analysis and the quantification process, and elements about how we've done our data gathering and data outputs. So with that, I hand across to Richard.
Thanks, Simon. I'm Richard Toomey. I'm manager here in data analytics, and my team look after all kind of geospatial data related data that comes in and out of our organisation. We handle lots of kind of big data, like the JBA data, which is many gigabytes and sometimes terabytes in size. And so what my team do is generally we kind of look at ways to manage that data in ways where the performances can be really quick and to produce it in a way that can be used seamlessly in our application MapView. Today I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about the data that we use for the IBC project. The initial phases, a data gathering phase we did, and we looked at what data was available in Canada. And so we were kind of going at this a little bit blind, that we didn't know what was available. And so we created a list of many municipalities, and we spoke to 90% of these We sent them emails, we rang them up, we had a look at what data was available in each municipality. We produced a list then and we sent it to IBC and JBA when we done that initial data gathering phase. We looked to gather many different types of data, mainly being terrain data. Obviously, the higher resolution, the better. We also looked at hydrometric data, snow cover data, rainfall, flood defences, historical flood, just to basically see what was available. Some of the data was available open source, and some of it was also available for commercial use. So we gathered up all this information, and we kind of delivered that back to JBA. And JBA used a lot of that information plus some of their own information that they gathered to produce the flood maps for Canada. The output of those flood maps included a fluvial model, a surface water model, and a combined model which combines both the river and surface water models together. And each of these models produced 7 return periods ranging from a 1 in 20 year to 1 in 1500 year. And again, each of them will have a return period, but it will also contain a depth information which will display the kind of level of water, the depth of water at each 30 meter cell size. Also, the output was an annual damage ratio at property level. So we worked with another partner who had a full address database for Canada with 10.5 million address points. For the IBC project, we were mainly concentrating on residential addresses, which was something in the region of 8.3 million addresses. We also produced a confidence layer, which is really denoting the accuracy of the data that was used within Canada. So obviously, some areas are more accurate than others. So JBA produced a layer where we can, clearly see that, with confidence that the data used in creating the flood model was very accurate in that particular area. We also looked at defended layer, so JBA produced a defended layer denoting the type of defence, its standard of protection, and the accuracy of that defence. Some of the some of the findings that we found. So there was, again, we were only looking at really residential addresses in Canada for IBC, and so we found of the 8.6 million residential addresses, 1.8 million were in some level of flooding, and 2.1 million addresses were covered by some level of defence. Now that might mean anything that it might be within a defended area, but if it was in a defended area that was less than a 500-year return period, and it was only in a defended layer of a standard of protection of 100-year, that would not be covered by the defences. So we looked at, there was about 1.8 million residential addresses that were had some type of flooding associated with it. Looking at some of the actual output of the JBA maps, we can see here we're looking at an area of London, Ontario, and we've got a number of defences there ranging from 1 in 20 year to 1 in 100 year. And within that particular area itself, there was over 118,000 properties. 16,000 of these properties were at some level of risk, and 11,000 are within those defended areas. Now, I guess, some of those 20-year defences, if we have a 1 in 100 year event, obviously those properties would still be at risk of that level of defence. Again, in Regina, we have a 25-year defended area. Again, 68,000 properties in this particular area, 13,000 of them within some level of risk, and only 2,700 within that defended area. And again, it's only defended to a 1 in 25 year, so a 1 in 100 year event, those properties will be at risk. I guess this is the level of data that some of our customers, well, most of our customers in the UK, are using this level of data now to assess risk and exposure within our application. Looking at our application ourselves, the data that JBA provide us is quite complex. They provide it in a raster and a vector format. It can range from, some of the layers, some of the raster layers are up to 50 gigabytes in size. So we've got a lot of kind of bespoke software algorithms that we use to manipulate the data and bring it into our application. And Dermot, one of my colleagues, will talk to you a little bit about the application in a moment. But just to bring the actual data into the application, there's a lot of kind of work that we have to perform to get the performance right, so you can visualize your data within the application. Once we get it in, then you can give the underwriter, and the underwriters are able to visualize that data. They're able to look at their policies, and they're able to spatially tag the underlying depth data from the models onto their policies, and they're able to give the underwriter guidance as to whether to accept flood cover or decline flood cover based on the rules set out. The actual, I'm just going to go through a couple of slides actually for the IBC. This is a slide from the IBC application. As you can see there, we've got the whole of the JBA flood model displayed on one screen there. Now, total size of that will be well over, I think, 100 gig. So to get that actually in the application and be able to pan zoom in that really quickly, we can see there that what we're shown are the provincial boundaries of Canada, and we can see there the count of addresses within that within each province, and we can tell you what the exposure is based on the addresses and the ADR value that we've used to spatially tag onto the addresses. And we can see there in Ontario we've got 3.4 million properties, and we can see down the left hand side we have an exposure based on that. As we zoom down into the application, we can look at individual FSAs. We can see there that for this particular FSA 6LT, we've got 5.5 thousand properties, and then we break that number down so we can see the exposure based on individual return periods. So if we look at the 1 in 20 year return period, we can see the count of properties within that is 365 at 6.6% of the total, and we have an exposure there of 179,000. We can break that down also by the depth of water, and we can tell that what level of what depth range it is for each individual property. We can also move down again into further down into an LDU. And this particular LDU is L6T201. We can see here that we've got 10 exposures in the one LDU, and of those 10 exposures, we've got a total exposure of 1.9 million. So I'm now just going to pass on to Dermot McNally, who's our project and product champion. Dermot.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Just in terms of, I suppose I want to pick up on the story. So we've seen essentially what can be done with the data, and that's been illustrated nicely with some screenshots from our MapView platform. And I just wanted to start by saying a few words about what our objective is for that platform. This is the dry textual slide. The rest is all pictures, where I'll actually show some of this in action. Really, our objective in delivering a tool like this is we want to provide, and Simon touched on this, we want to provide something that actually fits the insurance industry and basically bridges the gap between, I suppose, the geospatial calculations that you need to carry out in order to get some of these answers on the one hand, and the actual industry processes on the other hand. So the MapView platform is something that can work both in an interactive mode, which is what we'll see depicted in these slides, but also machine to machine to drive both automated and manual processes within the insurance industry. And really our goal is to have MapView act as a hub for all of the data that may be of relevance to these decisions that you need to make. So the kinds of data that MapView will bring into the platform and work with, on the one hand, you have risk location data, so your individual risk locations that are part of your active policies. MapView will store these and have these on file. We'll see when we get to the next slide that can drive your ability to work out accumulations at the time of underwriting, but also in terms of portfolio analysis and considering your exposure overall to flood or any other peril. Having that data on file allows us to do that. Likewise, of course, at the time of quote or for doing any kind of speculative what-if analysis, you can also load in specific data sets day to day in order to understand, to analyze these quotes or this information against both the kinds of peril information that we've seen in Richard's slide, and also in terms of the impact of accumulations on that quote. There are the peril data sets themselves, which we've heard about, but also point of interest data, and that can be anything like fire stations. If you're interested in response times in the event of a fire, it can be related to key hazard locations like chemicals. It depends on your particular area of interest. But essentially, just these are data sets that have a geospatial element and that are of relevance to your insurance business. And that brings on to I suppose the kinds of processing that the platform needs to do. Really, what we're trying to do is to do all these kinds of GIS operations that allow you to arrive at the answers that you need. So we've heard already about geocoding. Really, our ability, and we've talked a lot about flood, but our ability to give you an accurate score for exposure to flood for any location is driven out of our ability to know where any given address is. So good quality geocoding is probably the primary concern. The ability to calculate distances from one place to another, that's important. The ability to do what we call point and polygon calculations. So that, for instance, allows us to look at our location and say, okay, of all of the polygon areas that we have in our flood data set, is this particular location in any one of them, and what is the severity of that possible flood? It can do accumulation calculations, which, as I said, we'll see on the next slide. A huge part of the interactive tool is providing an on-map visualization of all of these things. So markers on the map showing where your risk locations are, and again, the kinds of overlays we've seen to show where the peril areas are. And then finally, you have interactive tools to allow you essentially to draw shapes on the map to define areas of interest to you and to understand, to perform calculations of how much exposure you have in those areas that you've defined. Fundamentally, our goal is to deliver all of this in a way that's optimized around the processes that the insurance industry cares about, because traditionally, I mean, there are lots of tools out there that will allow you to do the kinds of analysis that I've described and to consume the kinds of geospatial data that we've talked about. But often they require a big investment of time and energy and learning of a particular traditional GIS process in order to do it. Our approach is very much to follow the process of the insurance industry. The users of our systems are the insurance professionals themselves, or indeed are the actual automated systems that are just selling cover online. So really our job has been to design our system in order to integrate with both of those use cases, and really to do so in a way that isn't constrained by traditional GIS approaches. To move in then to some of the depictions of this, you know, we've seen already in the earlier slides how we can visualize areas of exposure to flood, and we're seeing that on this slide down the bottom right hand side, and we've seen how we can actually score based on those perils. Here what we're seeing is how MapView allows you to actually visualize and calculate accumulations. So we have this orange marker marked A, which is the location that we've actually analyzed, and we can see that it's not exposed. We can see that we're using the distance measurement tool to illustrate that it's nearly 400 meters away from an area that we think is of potential to flood. But what we can also see is by means of these circles that we're visualizing on the map, and you can see that there's a score panel down the bottom of the screen showing the number and the combined exposure of the risks that are within 50, 100, 250 and 500 meters. And whereas we have nothing at all up to 100 meters away, when we get to 250 meters, we can see that there's one single risk of 5.3 million, which based on, again, this is mock data, and we've set a rule that says that exceeds a threshold that indicates that should be shown as amber in terms of just any accumulation threshold that you might have. By the time we hit 500 meters, we have a total of 7 risk locations, adding up to an exposure of nearly 25 million, and we're showing that as red. So these are, you know, these calculations are performed automatically, spatially, based on knowledge of your current on-cover risks. So to move to the next slide, once again, this is an accumulation story, and I won't dwell on this. This isn't strictly related to flood, but it shows some of the sophistication you can do when you take a geospatial approach. Here, in addition to the circles that allow us to visualize accumulations at particular radii, this is actually from the City of London, and here we're heating actual building shape, building footprint data as well. So we actually have the shape of the footprint of the buildings. We're applying separation rules, and we're amalgamating these building shapes together into what we call blocks. And this is designed to create what we hope is a more accurate accumulation value in terms of the spread of fire. But once again, I suppose that the reason I want to show this off is because one of the driving goals of this platform is to deliver a tool to the insurance industry that will automate processes that if you were to want to do them by hand as an underwriter, if you wanted to understand the potential for a spread of a fire through buildings, you know, you could easily spend a few hours doing it, whereas we'll return you an answer within seconds, and we'll show you, and you'll see in the grid on the bottom there, we have primary block, which is the area you see in green. We say that there's a single risk location in there, 64,000 exposure, and likewise within all of the blocks, so including the blue blocks, which are one step removed from our primary one, we see we have a total of 6 locations, adding up to 3.2 million. Finally then, and I mentioned the fact that the user has an ability to draw their own shapes of interest, which I've done here on an area of Toronto. I've simply drawn this polygon, but you can draw circles and ellipses and also buffered lines. And you know, these can be used for anything, but if we want to look to our area of interest around flood, this could certainly represent, and is often used to represent, the footprint of a known flood event in terms of trying to understand what the losses may be due to that, or indeed it may be a piece of what-if analysis to speculatively identify a potential flood extent. So yeah, and we can see that we're told what the area of that is, and when we hover on it with our mouse, we see the width and height and information about the risk locations, the number of risk locations, and the total exposure contained within. So really that's, I suppose, an overview of the platform that we use to deliver all of this. So I suppose with that I'll hand over to Helen at JBA to talk some more about the underlying data. Thank you.
So I'm Helix Smith, and I'm the I head up the global hazard mapping team over at JBA, and we're based in North England. First of all, I'd just like to kind of set the context a little bit behind the project and add to what Lapo and the guys from LexisNexis have already explained. So flood modelling isn't a new concept in Canada by any means, and different provinces and municipalities have been carrying it out in different ways for a number of years. And there are maps that do exist, but there's by no means any national mapping standards in existence, and everybody does their mapping slightly differently. And so getting a coherent national view of flood risk is extremely difficult. So in recognition of that, we've undertaken this study in conjunction with the IBC. And undertaking a national scale hazard mapping study in less than 12 months was certainly ambitious. But we were keen to put JBA's previous global mapping experience to the test and see what we could achieve in order to meet the IBC's needs and Canada's insurance needs as well. So a lot of what we can achieve is dependent on what data is available, and that's, I suppose, one of the first areas to look. So the overall mapping approach that we used is one that many hydraulic engineers will probably recognise, but it's not been carried out on a national scale in Canada before. And to get these methods to work at a national scale certainly required some innovative thinking and some new developments and technologies. We not only needed to develop new hydrological modelling methods, but also we needed to adapt our existing hydraulic models to achieve the map creation in the allotted time frame that we were working to. The elevation data is one of the key inputs, and we think it's the single most influential input data set for the hazard mapping. So I'd just like to explain a couple of the terms first of all. Digital surface models represent the Earth's surface generally created by radar, and as a result the tree canopies and tall buildings in an area are often represented as high ground, and that's not ideal for hazard mapping, particularly in the urban areas where there's generally quite a high density of high-rise buildings. What we ideally want to do is use digital terrain model, or a DTM, to create our hazard maps with. But accessibility of DTM or bare earth terrain data isn't that great in Canada. Now it's worth mentioning that there is the Canadian Digital Elevation Dataset available, and that's free to use. But we've checked that out, and the quality of it does vary quite a lot across the country. It's fairly inconsistent, and a lot of it does seem to be contour derived, which again isn't ideal for hazard mapping. So ideally we would have the DTM everywhere. In practice it's not, but we have managed to acquire DTM for areas that cover about 34% of Canada's national population, and I'll discuss the DTM in a bit more detail later on as well. In contrast to the elevation data, Canada has an excellent hydrometric information data set available. So this enables us to develop robust hydrological models. So I'll just explain what I mean by a hydrological model first of all. It's simply a method that enables us to calculate river flows or rainfall depth for any part of the country, even where the observed data from gauges doesn't exist. Canada has an abundance of river gauge data, rain gauge data, and also some derived statistics that have been created by organisations such as Environment Canada. And the abundance of this data means that the unique characteristics of Canada's hydrology and the terrain can really be captured very well in the models that we've developed. So important considerations specific to Canada are not just snowmelt and frozen ground, which do play a key role, but also the extensive lake cover that, that there is in Canada. So the image on this slide just shows the network of the 565 rain gauges that are available across Canada, and that's just some of the information that we've used to create the inputs into the models. First of all, I'll just explain how we've created the rainfall model. So we needed a way to represent the depths of rainfall over time for different types of rain events. and this is described by a hyetograph. First of all, to create a hyetograph, you need to be able to calculate the amount of rainfall for a given storm duration with a particular frequency of occurrence. And for this, we use IDF curves, or intensity, duration, frequency curves, that we obtained from Environment Canada. We were interested in 3 different storm durations because we recognized that each type of rain event impacts quite differently in different topographies. So typically you'll find that a very steep area of land is particularly badly affected by high intensity, very short duration rainfall events. And then the lower lying flatter areas of land tend to be worst impacted when there's quite a slow moving, drawn out rain event. And we wanted to capture the worst case. So we actually modeled or created hyetographs for 3 different storm durations and modeled each storm duration separately, and then combined the outputs to give the worst case scenario in any given location. We also adjust the rainfall amounts to account for snowmelt, and I've got a bit more information on this on the next slide. But once we've adjusted the rainfall totals, we then convert them into hyetographs. The graphs that are shown on this slide are very simplified shapes, just as triangles, but the ones we used by using the US Soil Conservation Service method were much more sophisticated and fully represent a typical hyetograph for a Canadian rainfall event. So a bit of extra information on the snowmelt and frozen ground and how we've accounted for this in the hydrology. Snowmelt by itself is generally quite a gradual process, and it doesn't really represent a very high flood risk. But when there's snow already on the ground and then rain falls on top of that, it can lead to significant flooding, and you've experienced this a number of times in the past. So the volume of water from a rain event is bad enough, but then it's amplified by the melting snow. There's also the fact that surface storage is already reduced, so depressions that would not ordinarily slow down the sort of voyage of the water into a river channel, that process is kind of sped up because the storage is reduced already by snow filling those depressions. Also, when there's snow on the ground tends to be frozen, so this as well increases the runoff rates. And generally it's in winter when there's very limited vegetation, very few leaves on the trees, and so interception is much decreased as well. And so the rates of runoff are again amplified by that. What we do is calculate the volume of water from snowmelt on successive days at each of the gauge stations, so we can calculate how much snow there was on the ground at the start of the day and how much at the end, and calculate the volume of change. And we then combine that with the rainfall totals for the associated day. We recognise that snowmelt does occur obviously in a lot of places across Canada, but even where it does occur, it's not necessarily the driver behind the worst floods. Some areas of Canada suffer from the worst flooding in summer conditions, where there's just a very intense rainstorm on perhaps dry ground after a period of dry weather. And so we model the 2 different scenarios. We model a winter rainfall and a summer rainfall for every location, and we take the worst case forward. That kind of gives an overview of how we estimate the rainfall that can drive flood events. But to calculate or to properly understand the impact of rivers bursting out of their banks and the impact that has, we need to be able to model river discharges associated with different return periods as well. So this diagram gives an overview of the rather complex process that we developed in order to model the flows along all of the rivers. This is taken and adapted from a journal article written by Duncan Faulkner, who headed up the study at JBA, and it's due for publication in the Canadian Journal of Water Resources very soon. So keep your eye out for that if you want quite a lot of detailed technical information about it, or of course get in touch after the presentation with a few questions. I'm just going to give a very brief overview of this. So initially we carry out what we call an index flood analysis, which defines the relationship between river catchment characteristics and the flows that are observed at gauging stations across the country. So after quite extensive analysis, the most significant characteristics proved to be the effective catchment area that drains to a particular point, and the flood attenuation offered by lakes in that catchment. So a regression between those parameters and the observed flow values was developed and calibrated, and that enabled us to calculate QMed, or the median flow value, for any river at any location in Canada. Once we're able to do that, the second phase is to run growth analysis on using the flow records. And that's carried out by plotting the annual maxima from each gauge onto a growth curve. And that enables us to define the ratio between the median flow, QMed, and a peak flow associated with a given return period. And that gives us the main ingredients for what we need to calculate flood hydrographs to run through our models. So just in summary of what we get out of the hydrological modelling, we end up with methods that enable us to calculate rainfall amounts for any location in Canada for any return period that we want. And we can calculate river flows, and we've done that at 24,000 locations along the National River Network. We've been able to account for the impacts of snowmelt and also represent different land uses and ground conditions in those models. And that provides another ingredient into the hydraulic modelling. So the hydraulic models can be thought of as mixing pots really for the ingredients that we've already generated. So the rainfall estimates, the river flow estimates, the elevation data that we've discussed, and also we feed into the models information on land use data, for which in Canada we've used ecozone information. We then run the models to simulate how those water volumes are spread across the surrounding terrain. And to do that, we've used two different hydraulic models. So we have R-flow and J-flow. R-flow is extremely fast and uses 1D hydraulic calculation combined with 2D flood spreading algorithms to generate extremely quickly very credible flood map outputs. And we've used this more simplistic hydraulic model in the largely unpopulated areas of Canada. For the more urban populated areas and those where we've got the high quality elevation data, we always use J-flow, which although we consider it fast, it is significantly slower than the R-flow model. That's because it's a full 2D hydrodynamic model, and it's been specifically designed for large-scale hazard mapping. We've been developing it at JBA since 2002, and it's been benchmarked by the government, and there's a lot of sort of peer-reviewed literature that you can get on JFO. So they're the two models that we use. And then the output we've already seen a little of in the LexisNexis slides, but we've got national flood hazard maps for 7 return periods at 30-metre resolution, and at each one of those 30-metre cells there's a range of flood depths relating to return period. We've got over 5 million kilometres of river mapped, and then pluvial flooding for every catchment as well. And just to sort of reiterate, I suppose, that we've carried out full 2D hydrodynamic simulations at 30 metres for 3 storm durations and 7 return periods for all of Canada. So that's a massive undertaking and a real achievement that we're particularly pleased with. So just to give a bit of a different perspective of the flood maps, here's just a Google Earth 3D image of Calgary and our 100-year river flood map, and then the same again for Toronto. So hazard maps alone are very valuable for visualizing flood exposure in any area, and they also open up the door to development of other data sets that can be used particularly by insurers. So we can develop tools to aid underwriting decisions, and also tools for helping to estimate the long-term cost of flooding to a property, and that can then be used in order to help insurers pay their flood premiums. So that's annual damage ratio data that Richie mentioned very briefly earlier during his slides. Having a flood map as well also opens the door to generation of probabilistic models, and they can be used for flood warning and flood forecasting systems as well. So just to finish off then, where are we and where do we go from here. We've now got very good quality national flood hazard maps for the first time, and we've come a long way in improving the awareness of Canadian flood exposure. And it's the first study of its kind, really, and the output really is quite impressive. But we need to appreciate the current limitations and then strive to improve the maps further in future. For this, we need to look at more local characteristics, carry out perhaps more local studies, but ensuring consistent methods are used nationally. And then, obviously, to achieve more, we need more input data, higher quality, and just more of it. So we probably have roughly 60 to 70% accuracy in the hazard maps that we've got now. To reach sort of 80 to 90%, which is about the best that you could hope for with a model, the cost increases exponentially. For a relatively small improvement in accuracy, you've really got to invest significantly. What we recommend next is focusing that investment on obtaining more high-quality terrain data, so LiDAR really is what we need, and also flood defence data for Canada, which it's very difficult to get a full understanding of the flood defences that are out there, their condition, when they were built, and their standards of protection. So this is where future studies need to focus on. So thank you for your time. I'll now hand back to Dan for the Q&A session.
Thanks very much, Helen. If you didn't have a chance to answer your questions during the webinar, you should have a few minutes right now. We got quite a few questions in, so I will start reading them and do my best to address them to the appropriate presenter. So we had a few questions about coastal flood mapping. The presentation today focused on fluvial and pluvial. So I'm wondering, I think this would be addressed to Simon. What status are we with respect to flooding in Canada? Coastal flood mapping, sorry.
So maybe I can just introduce where we are with it, but then open that up to my colleagues. The project with the IBC team, as you can see from what we've walked through the last hour, and hence the question, is focused on pluvial and fluvial mapping. So it is something that is, I think, in the mind's eye of the guys on in IBC, but maybe Helen, maybe you can help me out here with a kind of any comments you might have on what you've looked at in terms of and the capability to build a coastal.
Sure. So JBA has quite a wealth of experience mapping coastal flood hazard, predominantly in the UK, but also in a number of different countries around the world. And we're just starting out with our Canada coastal mapping study, so we're just at a point where we're doing that sort of data inventory stage, out what's available in terms of historical data or hindcast tidal data, that kind of thing, just to be able to create a plan to develop these maps. And it's something that we're aiming to have available probably by autumn this year, or fall. I'm not sure which term you use in Canada, sorry. So sort of third quarter of the year.
Okay, thanks very much, Helen. Another question I think also for Helen is, you mentioned rainfall data sources from Canada, and there were a couple of questions related to consideration of climate change on extreme rainfall data. Was there a consideration of climate change, and if not, is there a plan to incorporate climate change impacts in flood risk mapping?
Okay, thank you. Yes, that is a good question. Currently the maps don't explicitly model climate change, so because they're based on historical rain and river gauge data, any long-term trends will implicitly be sort of represented to a degree. But certainly what we would be able to do in future is to generate maps specifically to show the impact of climate change. But given how much uncertainty there is in sort of all the various different climate change predictions, it's very difficult to say how the flood map will look in, say, 20 years' time. What's currently possible is to create the mapping for a given scenario. So to say, how would the hazard maps look if we were to see a 10% increase in rainfall over the next 10 years? And we can map that certainly, but it just relies on somebody defining that scenario that they want us to map.
Okay, thanks very much. Another question, a very specific question, is can you provide a sense of how the maps that you've produced would have compared to the actual flood event in Calgary in 2013? Did you compare it to that event, and did it look, were you able to sort of recreate that event accurately?
I guess that one's for me as well. Hugging over
Sorry, Helen.
Okay, thank you. We've done, what we do when we generate the maps is try to validate them, and when we say validate, what we're really doing is a credibility check. What we need to consider is the fact that in Calgary, the event that happened in 2013 will have a different return period at different spatial locations across it. So flooding from one river may have been, say, a 20-year return period, and on another river it may have been a 100-year return period. So that's generally how it works when there's a flood event. So it doesn't quite work to just take one of our return period hazard maps and compare it to the flooding that was observed. What we do is generally look for the key sort of inundated areas and make sure that our hazard maps have captured that in at least one of the return periods, and we're confident that they have done. What can be done is, based on an analysis of the rain records around the Calgary event, is to calculate some rainfall totals that were observed during that event and model them to create what we call a historical flood footprint. And that's something that we can do if it's of interest, but it's not something that we've yet done.
Okay, thanks again. And sorry, Helen, I think another question for you. All of the data used to produce flood maps is dynamic. You're talking about exposure, land use, changing floodplains, and so on. How will the tool, this might actually also be for the folks at LexisNexis, how will the tool account for the dynamic character of data? And a related question, how often will the data be updated? So I'll send that to Helen first, and maybe Richard, if you'd like to follow up with comments as well. Sure.
So as I've mentioned in my slides, we think the single most influential input data is the elevation data. So even as new rainfall or river gauge records are added to over the next couple of years, it's unlikely we'd return to remodel an area without having the improved elevation data available to do it on. We are constantly trying to find new sources of information for the elevation data in particular, and when that becomes available, we'll do a full review of the other inputs, so the land use data that's available and the hydrometry as well, so that we can always take the most up-to-date inputs and use those for any mapping that we redo. We are committed at JBA to running or to generating annual updates to the maps, but they certainly won't be updated. So all of the entire national maps won't be updated. The updates will focus on kind of specific areas where this improved elevation data is made available in the first instance. I don't know whether Richie or anyone at LexisNexis has anything to add to that.
Yeah, sure. So as a general kind of rule of thumb on other geographies that we work on, the UK, Ireland, we would generally update the flood data. JBA will produce it on an annual basis, but exposures and address data we would update. Address data set we'd update on a quarterly basis. If we're dealing with insurers, we might spatially geotag their data on a nightly basis. So if they have new policies or new book of business, they would come into us and we would spatially tag them on a nightly basis. So if there is new new estates, new houses gone in, and we can tag them overnight, because we update the actual address data very regularly.
Okay, thanks very much. A couple of other questions came in related to data sources in Canada and how the proposed maps relate to existing maps in Canada. So perhaps again for Richard, starting with Richard and then maybe to Helen, was there a comparison of the JBA maps to existing flood hazard maps in Canada? Was there, I guess, communication with some of the provincial governments who produce the current maps in Canada to sort of compare validity? Any comments on that topic?
Yeah, I think I might hand that one off to you, Helen. Although we did a lot of kind of data gathering exercises, we passed that information to JBA. So Helen, could you maybe, have you done any comparison on that?
We have, to a limited extent. Now it is quite tricky because we never compare in like with like, and the amount of information surrounding the sort of other data sources for the other hazard maps is quite limited, particularly to us, obviously, as a commercial company. Not everybody wants to tell us how they've gone about their mapping and their modelling. And so we don't really know whether we're comparing like with like. So our maps take the undefended flood hazard, whereas often ones that are done on a provincial scale or a municipal scale will simply provide a fully defended view. And so that can make things a little difficult. Also, a lot of the municipal maps are quite outdated, and the land use has changed significantly, so it's not necessarily appropriate to do direct comparisons in those areas. But we have done, like we've done with the sort of historical events in Calgary and Toronto and other areas, we've done similar sort of credibility checks against our maps for as many locations as we can, and they're generally speaking the municipal maps or the provincial maps that are available online.
I guess just to add to that, Helen, Richie here again, that what we do on various occasions is we will take an insurer's various claims that they've had, and we can spatially tag them against the JBA model to see how they compare against actual claims.
Okay, thanks very much. Another question I think I'll have to pass again to Helen and then maybe to Richard and Dermot for some further comment. Can you please better describe your pluvial flood model? For example, how are city sewage systems listed in the earlier LexisNexis presentation included in the overall model?
Okay, so the sewage systems aren't explicitly modelled, so we don't model the manholes, as we call them in the UK, so where the water goes in and where it might come out. We don't model in that much detail, but what we do for every urban surface is assume a certain percentage of the runoff can be taken away by the urban drainage systems, and that proportion of rainfall is calculated by what we call CN numbers, which are we've got different CN numbers for different land uses based on the eco zones and other land use information, and they're used to just adjust the percentage of runoff that we apply to the hydraulic models to kind of take a net volume of rainfall forward.
Yeah, I don't really have anything further to add on that, but certainly, if there is a data set, we can plug it into our own application for visualizing.
Okay, thanks very much. Getting back to an earlier question, I think this one for Simon and Dermot. So you mentioned 1.8 million addresses at some risk of flooding. Does this number account for flood defenses?
So that was Richie here. No, that number, we can absolutely give that number, but the number that I showed on screen, the 8.3 million residential addresses, we only looked at the actual amount of properties that were in that defence. So we would have to give a various different numbers. So how many are defended up into a 20-year, 75-year, 100-year, up to 50 and 100-year. So we can certainly break that number out, but we haven't done at that particular slide.
Okay, thanks. Another pretty specific question, perhaps again for LexisNexis. Simon, is there any progress? Some insurers in Canada are offering coverage for groundwater flooding as well. Is there any progress toward risk mapping or hazard mapping for this hazard?
This currently isn't on our radar. The elements of the data input that we've talked about, utilised for the modelling thus far, would come into play. And it's a model that I know that JBA has worked on in the UK. So in terms of the methodology and the elements to calculate it, to create the model, it's largely there. It's not a form of water peril that we've kind of been, I guess, looked towards, pushed towards, directed towards by any clients or the IBC as of yet, but we're totally open to having a discussion about that and looking at whether that's on a provincial, municipality or nationwide basis. If it's anything like here in the UK, it's quite a there are certain areas that are susceptible, and therefore we've focused effort on creating the model in those. So if the questioner would like to get in contact with us, we can talk more specifics about that.
Okay, thanks. Another question, I think, for Richard. What damage functions did you use to estimate losses?
So we used a partner in Canada who provided us with replacement cost values aggregated to post to LDU an LDU area, and so we used that aggregated data and we multiplied that by the JBA's ADR value to get the exposure. Maybe you can add something else to that, Helen?
So the ADR calculations themselves incorporate damage functions which look at, well, we have separate damage functions for different property types, so we can differentiate between, say, a single-story building with no basement, or a two-story building with a basement, and that kind of thing. So we've developed damage functions for those, predominantly based on research from the UK and the USA. Damage functions don't exist specifically for Canada to a level of confidence that we're happy with, and this is an area that we're looking to improve for future ADR updates, and we're currently just starting another research project into developing some additional damage functions for that.
Okay, thanks very much. Some more questions related to, I suppose, the current situation for flood mapping in Canada, and I think again for Richard, are the confidence layer and defended layer available to be reviewed for the province of Ontario?
To be reviewed, so I'm not entirely sure what you mean about to be reviewed, but the defended areas that JBA have provided, I guess it's the first iteration that we have of them, and I think Helen mentioned that the data will be reviewed on a constant basis when we get better information available. Again, I think I'm answering for JBA here, but I think a lot will depend on underlying DTM data. So how accurate the DTM data is will define how accurate the defended area is. The confidence layer.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to jump in.
Yeah, I was just going to say.
That's actually luckily one of the layers that isn't so dependent on the elevation data, and so we're less limited in that respect. But what we have found is it's incredibly difficult to find information about all the different defence schemes that are in place, what there is out there and what standard of protection they are, and then to be able to have confidence in that information as well. We found that very difficult, but it's something that we're about to give a complete review to. So, Richie, as you said, we're on you've got the sort of first version of our defence information in your application at the moment, and we're looking to update that and provide you with a new layer by probably the end of March, after doing another extensive review and just trying to harvest more data really and more information on the defence schemes. And it's an area of significant investment in Canada at the moment, with new defence schemes popping up pretty frequently. And so we do plan to review that on a quarterly basis over the next year or two, so that we can try and keep on top of the new developments that are going on in terms of defences and flood mitigation measures in Canada.
Okay, thanks again, Helen. Another question I think for Richard is the flood hazard tool good for commercial exposure? What additional considerations are needed to account for commercial risks?
I'll pick up on this as Dermot speaking. Yes, I mean, so the platform fundamentally isn't concerned about the nature of the risk that it handles. Indeed, in the UK and Irish markets, so the number of things, including just the higher value of those risks and the greater effort that it's worth underwriters taking in just examining them. And what I suppose we would take the view that the use that the industry will make of it, it's not really for us to steer how they interpret the data. Obviously, an area of exposure to flood is still an area of exposure to flood, though the characteristics of the buildings will determine what you would want to do about that. A higher building you would treat a little, perhaps a one-story or two-story house. By the same token, you'll take a different view of things like business interruption. But I mean, in terms of the underlying data, same data, because it's all to do with where the water goes and our ability to keep track of where your risk locations are and the various parameters pertaining to them. So your knowledge of your exposure. We're equipped to do that for commercial risks just as we are for household.
Yeah, I guess on the actual data side of it as well, we for the IBC project we only used residential properties, and we extracted out what commercial properties, or what we thought were commercial properties. It was quite difficult with the data set we had.
I mean, so, clearly the ADR data, for instance, that we have is specific to household.
Yeah, absolutely, it's specific to residential. So when we were calculating the average replacement cost, we obviously took out the commercial records because we didn't want those results skewed on the aggregation per LDU.
Okay, thanks very much. A question for Helen. What is the minimum catchment area in the hydrology model?
Okay, so the maps that come out of the different hydrological models don't have a minimum catchment area threshold. But the differentiation between rivers that tend to be generated or the flooding on them is driven by intense rainfall events, is the method for estimating that is separate to that we estimate the sort of traditional fluvial rivers bursting out of banks flooding using. So that method, where we use the index flood and the growth curve analysis, was applied to all rivers that drain a catchment greater than 500 kilometres square.
Okay, great. Again, question for Richard and perhaps Simon. So there was some discussion of collection of data from municipalities across Canada. Did you get a sense during your discussions that there was a willingness to adopt the mapping that's coming out of this project at individual municipality level?
I'll answer that. Well, my French has improved, but yes and no, I would say. I mean, we spoke to, there was lots of people very interested in it, and we've lots of people, in some municipalities we were past the pillar to post, but in most cases we found that people were willing to speak to us to share data, but there was certainly one or two municipalities where they just kept their cards fairly close to their chest and didn't share information with us.
Okay. So another question, and this has come up a couple of times in the comments about some lot level factors. Does your, again, I think for Richard and Dermot, does your tool account for, I guess you might say, base floor elevation? What is the consideration for base floor elevation? Is it the basement floor? Is it the first floor? And along those lines, is there consideration for lot level protections? You know, backwater valve, sump pumps, something that we talk about a lot in Canada. Are these factors also considered in your tool?
So the tool in theory could do it given the data. My understanding is that wouldn't be something present in this current data set. We are involved, we have an ongoing project with some partners in the UK around, well, in this particular instance it's slightly different, but it's to do with property level protection against floods. So the flood barriers for doorways, things like that. It isn't the norm among users of our platform to have that degree of knowledge about buildings. Given the knowledge, you know, there are ways that we could deploy that data that would allow, you know, that would allow useful use of it. But certainly it's not the norm, and you know, for us it's a brand new area. Access to the data being usually the big challenge.
Okay, thanks. Very specific insurance industry question. For more transactional, more direct personal lines writers that normally provide quotations in seconds versus minutes, how can this model be applied into the high-paced workflow of these types of quick turnaround writers? Again, this would probably be for Richard and Dermot.
So I'm Dermot here, and I'll answer that. So I touched on it really briefly at the beginning of my section, where I described the fact that this platform can support both the kind of interactive user interface case that we're illustrating in slides, because that makes for a good visual. But in fact, for, you know, and you know, we've been really talking all about residential properties during this talk, and clearly those normally are underwritten in exactly the fashion you described. So we, for our various home customers, typically they will query us on a machine-to-machine level. All of these same data sets that we've seen visualized can be queried. All of the geocoding operations that you need in order to turn the postal address of the customer has likely provided into the coordinates that you need in order to get your flood score back. That all gets done automatically and extremely quickly. We have a number of strategies to ensure that that our response to such queries is extremely fast, including the pre-tagging of an entire address dictionary for the country concerned, and our application lives on our own proprietary big data platform, the high performance computer cluster we call HPCC, which is a technology that LexisNexis developed and has since open sourced. So the access to the scores is there. Now, it is of course for the industry to lay down their own business rules on top of that and determine how they wish to interpret a particular kind of a flood score. But typically what's going to happen, and especially for automatic underwriting, the rules will be set. They will either be communicated to us, in which case we will return the score as basically a three-state or two-state thing, which is accept, decline, or perhaps accept, decline, or refer. Or alternatively, what some of our customers will do is say, just give us the score and our own systems will make that decision. So yeah, automatic underwriting without human intervention, very much the norm, but it does require that you lay down your rules in advance and understand what you're going to do based on the scores that we return.
Okay, thanks very much. I think we'll have two more questions and we'll call it a day. First question for Helen, kind of a technical question. So there was discussion of the return periods that are going to be presented in the maps, and the most, or the least frequent of which was the 1500-year return period flood. This is not something that we're largely familiar with in Canada. Arguably, most of our flood maps aren't designed to provide information to that level. Can you provide a little bit more information on how those return periods were calculated?
Yeah, okay. So the 1500-year return period is very much a return period that's been driven by client requests in the past. So through our work in the UK and Europe and elsewhere in the world, it's really been sort of fed back to us that that's what people are interested in, particularly when they're considering reinsurance. Obviously, when you're basing your models on river or rainfall gauge records that very rarely actually extend up to even 100 years of data. More typically, a river or rainfall gauge will hold between 20 and 60 years of data. There's obviously quite a high degree of uncertainty when you're extrapolating those records to calculate river or rain volumes for the 1500-year return period. And that's just something that we sort of have to accept and acknowledge and live with, really. Certainly when defences are built, they tend to be developed to more of a 100 or 200-year standard of protection, and it really is only for when you're looking at your sort of maximum probable loss across an area that you want to be considering the 1500-year return period, because there is such a high degree of uncertainty with it.
Great, thanks very much, Helen. So final question, and this was probably the most popular topic of the question period, and I think this one will go to Simon, because unfortunately we've lost Lapo, so we don't have somebody from IBC to comment on it. But could you provide some information on how to access the tool, when it'll be available, who can access it, government, insurance, public, etc.
So the tool, thank you. So the tool is available now, as Lapo spoke about, and I can reiterate the data sets are built into the MapView LexisNexis platform and available. We are, I guess the bottom line is we're keen to talk and discuss with the audience here the detail about how the access to the service can be granted. It runs on a software as a service basis, which means that it is very rapid to deploy, both in terms of into frontline underwriting, and I guess slightly longer to build it into your existing policy administration and quotation systems. But the combination of the software and the flood data, together with the geocoding engine as well, is installed and ready to be deployed across the Canadian market, and indeed we are doing that already with some insurers today. So please do use my email address that is on the screen at the moment, and I would be happy to begin the conversation and discuss the practicalities of how to do that with anyone who is keen to progress that discussion.
Okay, thanks very much, Simon. So we're going to draw it to a close here. Thanks again, Lapo, Simon, Richard, Dermot, and Helen, for participating in this very excellent, informative webinar. It was very complicated, and I think we pulled it off pretty well, given the locations of everybody. If anybody else has questions, please feel free to contact the presenters. Their email addresses are provided on your screen now. There's many questions we didn't get to today, and we have recorded the webinar, and we'll be posting it soon. And for those of you who are our normal listeners, we'll have another webinar coming up on February 19th. A staff member from the City of Toronto is going to be talking about the flood mitigation work that's been going on there since the recent floods in July 2013 and August 2005. So watch your inboxes for information on that. And with that, thanks very much for joining, and this concludes the webinar.